favor de sentarse, please have a seat. So we continue during Lent our journey through the Gospel of John. We will take a couple of forays outside of John over the course of Lent as we look at 6 more stories of transforming grace. Ways in which the grace of God moves us from scarcity to abundance, from there not being enough to there being more than enough. Like those we have seen, some will move from a place of illness to a place of wholeness. Some, like Nicodemus, are invited to be reborn, to be born again from above. Some, like the woman today, whose story we read, are invited to move from guilt to pardon and mercy. Now, every single one of us has made some big mistakes in our lives. Maybe it was an act of betrayal that destroyed an important relationship. Maybe it was the imposition of our will on a child in such a way that alienated and fractured that relationship, perhaps for good. Maybe it was the day we lost our temper at our boss and were fired from our job and sent into a tailspin of uncertainty. Maybe it was our failure to get the help we needed to recover from an addiction, and it cost us our entire family. Maybe it was an affair that destroyed a marriage. If you haven't already had a big blunder, trust me, you will. It seems almost like part of what God does to help us discover our need for mercy and to turn from the foolishness that we often find ourselves engaged in. This woman's story is a story about a big blunder. And it's a very fascinating story. It's a story that only is found in John's Gospel. John was written 20, even maybe 30 years later than all the other Gospels. And it's very different from the 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, called the Synoptic Gospels. One of the things about John is that the stories told in John are much more complete and much more complex, with more dialogue and more character development. That the stories have a very clear theological focus to them. They have a continuity about them that you don't find in the other Gospels, which are a little more kind of hacked together and pieced together. It's almost like Matthew, Mark, and Luke were gathering up all the fragmented stories that they knew of and just trying to piece them together in a way that made the best sense that they could. But John had another 30 years to reflect on the stories and even maybe to gather others that came from other sourcing. But this story is only in John. And in fact, if you look in most modern translations, you will notice a footnote at the beginning and at the end of this story. And down in the very small, tiny print, it will say something like, most ancient manuscripts don't have this story in them. Which is an interesting little mini lesson in how the Bible got put together. It didn't just drop from heaven. It was gathered and edited. Each gospel was gathered and edited by maybe a community of people, maybe not even just one individual over time. And those gospels that were created were written down and then copied. And every time they were copied, frequently somebody would add a word to try and clarify something, or add a phrase, or they would have discovered something that wasn't in the text that they inherited, and they would embellish that with other words. Somehow, this story found its way into John. And we don't know exactly when. But I'm so grateful that it did, because it is one of my favorite stories in the whole Gospel of John. And if there's one thing that whole reality should teach us about Scripture, is how ridiculous it is for some folks to claim that Scripture is absolutely without any errors at all. I mean, just the fact that you got 4 different Gospels that are not all completely identical, that have stories that are different, that draw conclusions that are different, shouldn't that tell you at least that God, doesn't need it all to be exactly uniform? That God has a little bit bigger sense, wider sense of how we can tell the story of Jesus authentically and really and valuably for one another, without it having to be exactly this way or that way? It says that to me, at least. But I want to pick this story up and dig in, because it's got some really, really, really important lessons. So the scenario is a woman who is caught in the midst of an affair with somebody, some relationship with a man who is not her husband, and she is drug out of the house, leaving the man behind, right? He's like not responsible for anything that happened. She's drug out of the house, probably half naked, if not totally naked, into the public square of the Temple Plaza, where Jesus is calmly sitting down and teaching people. She knows what the cost is going to be. And the scribes and Pharisees who have grabbed her and are bringing her into this public arena do so fully with the expectation of blood. Because the law of Moses is clear. A person caught like she was caught is to be stoned to death publicly. That's the law. Crystal clear. No question. That's the law. But on top of the shame, the vergüenza of what happened to her, she is being drugged into becoming the bait for another trap. Because they're trying to trap Jesus with her. It's not bad enough that she's facing the consequence of her own sin, but she's now being used by them to try and get Jesus killed as well. Because you see, ever since chapter 5, when Jesus healed the man by the pool, the leadership in Jerusalem is plotting to kill him. They're trying to find a way to justify arresting him and putting Jesus to death. So we don't just have this woman's life on the line in this story, but we have Jesus' life on the line in this story. And their lives are now intertwined by this encounter in the Temple Plaza, where she is held almost or fully naked before all of these men who are ready with stones in their hand to pelt her into hamburger. And Jesus sits on the ground, drawing pictures in the dust with his fingers. In seminary we were taught to try, in periods of anxiety and tension, we were taught to exhibit a non-anxious presence as a pastor. Be a non-anxious presence and lead from that lack of anxiety. Jesus is the picture of a non-anxious presence in the midst of what has to be almost a circus of craziness. And they bring her to him, and they put the question to him. This woman was caught in the midst of adultery. The law of Moses requires us to stone her to death. What do you say? They fully expect Jesus to be forgiving and pardoning. But if he is, then he will be in direct opposition to the law of Moses, and bam! The trapdoor shuts. And he's dead. Now, it would have been interesting if that day the folks had something that I found out about was available just this week, thanks to one of my clever members who sent this picture to me. They could have had a Jesus slingshot and cast those stones with the Jesus slingshot, because then they wouldn't even have to touch the stone. Jesus himself could be the one who flung it, right? That was very funny, Margie. Thank you for sending that. I love that my church members send me irreverent humor. I deeply appreciate it. But on that day, the men held the stones in their hands, ready to pelt her. And ready, once they've pelted her, to grab Jesus and kill him as well. So what Jesus does is fascinating. He stands up when he refuses to answer and they keep pelting him with the questions. He stands up and he looks at them and he says, whichever of you is sinless, go ahead. Throw the first stone. He doesn't contradict Moses. He turns the focus from her and from him to their own conscience. He requires them to look at themselves. And in the doing of that, he sits back down and begins to scribble in the dust again. One of those copiers who wrote the different copies of John, one of the ancient texts has the phrase, and he wrote in the sand each of their sins. Interesting addition to the text. That Jesus wrote words that reminded them, and I love this detail, from oldest to youngest, what their sins were. Because the older we are, the more mistakes we've made. And hopefully, the wiser, maybe, we've become, the more gentle, the more aware of our own failures. Because as Jesus writes, from oldest to youngest, the men begin to go home, leaving their lives behind, one by one, as they remember the crap they carried from their own mistakes. And eventually they're all gone. And the woman who probably has been like that, both to cover her nakedness and to protect herself against the coming stones, finally looks up into the eyes of Jesus. He says to her, "Has no one condemned you?" "No, Master." "No, sir. No one." And Jesus, very matter-of-factly, says, "Neither do I." He's not had to declare any judgment on the law of Moses. He simply turned those men inward on their own failures, that their own consciences would convict them, until he would simply say, I have no reason to condemn you. And then he says, go. And my paraphrase, don't do it again. I don't think he says, don't ever sin, ever. He's not laying the expectation on her that she never make another mistake in her life. What I think Jesus is saying is what we all should learn, and that is when you make a big mistake, at least look deep enough inside to figure out why you made it so that you won't make it again. Learn the lesson. Learn the lesson that you and you alone have to figure out got you where you went. So, in my mind, there's 3 huge lessons from this text. Really, really, really important lessons from this text. The first one is, look at your own life before you point fingers at somebody else. It's huge. Look at your own life before you point fingers at somebody else. Because plenty of times, the things that we really don't like out there in other people are things that we're not willing to acknowledge are right here inside of us. Psychologists call that projection. In 12-step programs, they call it, you spot it, you got it. I love that. I remember that even better. You spot it, you got it, right? So, pay attention to what's going on in you before you start pointing fingers. Second one is what he told the woman. Learn the lesson so you don't repeat it. Now that you're aware of what you've done, learn the lesson. Figure out what it is that got you there so you don't repeat it. Because, another thing I've learned from my 12-step friends, wherever you go, there you are. And if you don't figure out what got you into that mess, and you take yourself over into this new situation over here, you still got that same stuff inside of you that got you in that mess the last time. And unless you figured that out, you're going to take yourself wherever you go, and you're going to repeat that same thing over again. So, you and you alone can do that work of learning the lesson. And the last huge lesson from this story is that mercy, not judgment, is the heart of God. Mercy, not judgment, is the heart of God. Amen. And if we have received that mercy, then we should give it to others. So, those are 3 really big lessons in a story that almost didn't make it into John's Gospel. But I am so glad that it did. Let's pray. In your never-ending work to make us more like Jesus, oh God, please help us to hear the lessons that you offer us today, that we may be transformed and not just wish for transformation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Grateful to God for all of the ways in which we have been blessed with mercy, with forgiveness,